Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host, Omar Khalid Butt. Today is Friday, the 27th of May, 2022. The month of May is coming to an end, but the stories are abound to discuss and talk with you. Let's discuss those one by one. Let's give you a little review of what we're going to discuss during the course of the show. The first segment is going to be on the government's economic strategy. We've seen what kind of issues our government, our nation has had economically in the past few years and in the past few months. All of this has been highlighted by the current government. Now that the prices of petroleum products and petroleum have been increased by around 30 rupees per kind of petroleum product, what kind of effect this is going to have on the economy and on the current IMF talks that are going on with the government? Is the IMF satisfied? Will it be satisfied with this increase in 30 rupees, or does it want more? What kind of other solutions need to be put in place by the government or by the society itself to curb the current issues that pertain to the economy? This is going to be our first segment. Government's economic strategy. We know that there have been announcements made by Mifta Ismail Saab concerning the increase in rupees 30 for the petroleum products. But despite that, is that enough? Will there be more changes that will be announced in the government in the coming days? And if so, or even if it's not the case, what kind of measures does the government or the public sector or the private sector or us as individuals need to take? More in the following report.
Higher international energy prices, pandemic-induced recession, geopolitical developments, and elevated global food prices from supply disruptions is increasing inflationary pressures worldwide, with a trickle-down effect on Pakistan also. In order to navigate turbulent economic waters, the government raised the prices of all petroleum products by rupees 30 per litre, the highest ever increase in the prices of all petroleum products in one go in a bid to rein in the fuel subsidies. The fuel subsidies had been a sticking point in talks with the IMF in resumption of a $6 billion facility which has been stalled since early April. US dollar plummeted by rupees 3 against Pakistani currency, sliding to rupees 199 in interbank market. Meanwhile, Pakistan's stock exchange benchmark KSE 100 index rose nearly 900 points and crossed 43,000 barrier during intraday trade. Finance Minister Mifta Ismail expressed hope that now the exchange rate would improve, markets would stabilize, economy would balance out, and investors would take decision positively. IMF has urged FBR to fetch rupees 7.2 trillion in taxes for the upcoming budget. In its handout, the IMF has emphasized the urgency of concrete policy actions while emphasizing that considerable progress has been made during mission-level talks, including on the need to continue to address high inflation and elevated fiscal and current account deficits.
To discuss more on this very important issue, we've been joined by Dr. Usman W. Chohan. He's a political economist. Dr. Saab, thank you very much to have joined us. When we look at the current economic situation as far as the free fall of the rupee, as we have seen in the current months, was concerned, or the stock exchange that was plunging at a very rapid rate, a lot of people were extremely perturbed by all of that. But Mifta Ismail's announcement to increase the price of petroleum products has kind of brought some kind of resurgence in both the PSX as well as the rupee. Is that enough? Will we see more gains in the PSX and the rupee as the days unfold? And what more needs to be done?
That's an excellent question, because it might seem counterintuitive that raising the prices of petrol, which hurts the consumer, was responded to positively by the stock market and by the forex, the currency markets. Why would that be? It is because the biggest pressure on the rupee and on the stock market is the fear that we won't get an IMF agreement settled. If we have an IMF agreement going forward, then the rupee will be much stronger, because in exchange for that agreement with the IMF, we will have a deposit, an extended fund facility, something to help us in the interim in a particularly difficult situation. Now, as far as the fuel subsidy goes, it is 30 rupees. It's about a 20% increase for your standard oil metrics, and it's a 25% increase in diesel, and in kerosene, it's about 24%. It's quite high for the consumer, and people do struggle with having higher oil prices. You saw the lines at the pumps yesterday. But the bigger question, the billions of dollars question, is can we get an agreement with the IMF? And this is a first step to alleviating what they consider a concern in terms of fiscal sustainability, because you pay a lot of money to subsidize the price of oil in this country.
Now, Dr. Chohan, when you look at the IMF and the demands that they had made to the Pakistani authorities, they had not only asked for complete withdrawal of the subsidy on the petroleum products, but also the revival of petroleum levy and the general sales tax. Is that possible, or do you foresee a gradual increase in the demands, or a gradual increase to the compliance in the demands made by the IMF?
It is, you're absolutely right. It is a gradual process, because 30 rupees does not represent the full extent of the subsidy. The government's own claim is that it's about 86 rupees per liter in subsidy. So this is only a gradual approach, and further hikes will therefore have to be taken. You can then deduce that it may go up by up to 86 to remove the entirety of the subsidy. The argument of the IMF is that you have a lot of constraints and expenses, and you simply don't get enough taxes on the fiscal side, and you don't export enough on the current account side to be able to sustain this stuff. So the people then have to bear the brunt of that, live within their means, quote unquote, and therefore pay a price that is more in line with world markets. Because actually you will realize that in Pakistan, the price of oil is much, much cheaper than in most countries. It's probably one of the lowest for a country that doesn't itself produce oil, which creates a big distortion from their point of view. Although for our consumers, they feel entitled to it. They feel like this is already quite expensive. And given the income levels in the country, they feel like, well, anything more would be unreasonable. I mean, that's just too much of a cost, given bigger structural factors. The structural factors being, we don't have extensive public transport in this country anymore. The population density is very high. Commuter times are very long. Traffic tends to be in urban areas quite dense. Even in previously well-planned areas, it's quite dense. So the structural things also make it quite difficult to get things done without not incurring some fuel in the process to move around.
I think that's very important, Dr. Chohan, because in the current state of affairs, and looking at also the price of petroleum, as you've just mentioned, across the world, including in the West, it is much higher than the prices at which petroleum products are currently available in Pakistan, despite the increase in the 30 rupees. This said, you talked about taxes. Now, that is a very important point that I'd like to understand your point of view on. A lot of people still are not paying their taxes as they should. They haven't entered the tax net, as the previous government had said that it would make more and more people enter the tax net. Despite its efforts, it hasn't happened. What needs to be done now to make more people enter the tax net? Because that is extremely important. All the Western countries, the developed world, they rely more on the taxes that the people pay.
Yes, you're absolutely right that this is at the crux of the issue, that people have taken things lightly for about 70 years. If I look back at the economic history of South Asia, taxation was not very lax. If I go back to the Mughal Empire, they would certainly extort the money out of the people, and there was no nonsense about this at the Subedar level and so on. So South Asian history has had robust tax nets in the past, but in the past 70 years, we've been quite lax about it. And you're absolutely right that it is not tax depth, but tax breadth, that you have to spread it across society. We do tax heavily certain parts, and that is quite unfair to those people who are genuine and want to pay their part, and they do that. So direct taxation is very distortionary. But the argument against that is that indirect taxation has been quite high in Pakistan. That is because, so for example, when you buy cigarettes or you replenish your phone, your SIM card, etc., everybody pays that tax. And that is because that is easier to collect. So they simply just reduce what they give you, and that tax is then given to the government. Indirect taxation is very distortionary because it goes against the poor, because poor people then have to pay a larger percentage of their income for those things. So sales tax is an easier way to do it, but probably isn't the fairest way to do it. So a more balanced, simple, neutral, efficient, direct taxation mechanism is the way to go. I've done a lot of work on this, but I find that generally tax effort, as it is called in the literature, is very low in Pakistan, and the citizens in general, companies as well, they try to find ways to pay as little, such as under-invoicing, such as mispricing. There's many ways to get around it, and ultimately society loses when people don't pay their part. So you're absolutely right that this is where the focus should be. The previous government did make improvements and did try to push it, but there's a lot of political pushback. I mean, political pushback as in the public is not too keen to pay more, but then you have these situations like fuel just going up in general. Then everybody has to pay because the right people didn't pay the right amount at the right time.
Do you think under the current circumstances, and of course the petroleum products that are now being increased, and the people are understanding that there is no way out apart from further reducing the subsidies on petroleum products, and there's even talk of subsidies on electricity as far as the IMF demands are concerned, do you feel this will lead to more stringent laws as far as making more and more people enter the tax net, or do you feel a lot of people will still shirk away from that?
Oh, this is a tricky question, because people will always do their best to avoid this sorts of thing. They just simply don't have the ethos to then contribute to a national effort. And we all suffer because of that. Distortions will continue to happen. But unfortunately, what might likely happen is that those who were already voluntarily doing their part are being squeezed more. And this creates even more unfairness and resentment. So tough enforcement and oversight is a big part of it. Your agencies that deal with this, ranging from the FBR down to even at the local municipal level, they have a part to play. They have constraints. I understand that, whether it's because of resources or whatnot, but having a more stronger and more inclusive and expansive tax network across society is the only way forward. And as far as the fuel subsidies come as part of it, this is a natural consequence of the fiscal decline that happens as you subsidize, but you don't, everybody enjoys that subsidy, but not everybody does their part. And so in the long run, you will have to get rid of these distortions anyways, unless you generate extra surplus tax or you export so much that you don't worry what you're importing. But that's not the case here. Remittances, for example, are now a backbone of the economy, $3 billion a year. And remittances used to be 1/5 the size of exports 20 years ago. Now they're as large, which means that exports simply haven't grown in 20 years. So we have to ask, what are we doing in terms of driving our economy?
That's a very important question, Dr. Chohan. What has happened? Why haven't we been able to increase our exports, despite we having the privilege of having the GSP Plus from the European Union, something that is going to go on for renewal very soon. But nevertheless, it's a very important mechanism. The US has been importing a lot from Pakistan as well. Why can't we increase our imports? What have been the detrimental factors that have not allowed us to increase our exports?
This is an excellent question, because I could answer this in terms of nitty-gritty details for you, why this industry, that industry, but that's not the real issue. The real issue at hand is cultural. And the cultural issue is the lack of innovation in our society, because the people who have a space to produce and sell, they tend to, what we call in Urdu, teka le liya hai. They just occupy the space and are comfortable selling the exact same thing 1,000 years into the future. They do not innovate. They do not find the competition. They just exploit the way things are and are happy. That is why, for example, a car you buy today, I won't pick a certain name, but a small vehicle has the exact same features as it did 30 years ago. Nothing changes. You just sell soap to the people, towels, and the same then happens with exports. You're selling bed linen and towels. Nothing has changed with the substance of the product in the last century or this one. So the innovation
here you're talking of local products, Dr. Chohan, but when you talk of local products and you talk about the prices having increased, but nevertheless no innovation, no new technology being introduced, and you were taking the automotive industry as a test case as far as that is concerned. Although we've seen some changes, but not as much as even in India, we see a lot of new products coming almost every 2 or 3 years. Do you feel that the big manufacturers or the big local bigwigs as far as the industry is concerned have become more and more lax, because they say the public is buying it, so why innovate? Why bring new products in the market if the public is happy with the old?
This is exactly what I'm trying to say. There is no drive to improve things, to cut the cost, to make things facilitate the consumer, because there's no incentive to do that. There's no competition. The structure of the market doesn't incentivize large-scale producers and salespersons to do anything. So you become essentially a trading nation selling the same thing to people. That also then reflects in the exports, because you sell the same thing abroad of the same quality, irrespective of time. And the other part of culture at the deeper level is that we have become a consumer society. So we had an excellent GDP growth rate over the previous period of 6%, which should be impressive, but when you break down what it is largely driven by consumption and imports. Consumption and imports are the opposite of exports and investment or savings. So if you drive growth through this, it becomes unsustainable in the long run. You might have a nice accounting figure, but you're a consumer society. When you look around at what we need to produce, we should be a productive society across all tiers. We don't see that reflected, and therefore we have to borrow. So borrowing means you're using foreign savings to consume, and that is not a sustainable way. That is ultimately the argument of the IMF, that you need to be a productive society. But the counter argument is, if you're raising electricity, you're raising fuel, you're not easing the productive capacity. Your austerity is not a pathway to growth. You're just cutting down on costs, but you're not driving things. So I don't believe that IMF solutions philosophically make sense, but they are the stopgap that might be required, given that we haven't made changes over 2 generations to our economy.
But then what is the middle way as far as some kind of a middle ground for the IMF and for the Pakistani government under these current circumstances? Because I understand that a lot of countries are also withholding the money they want to give to Pakistan or other organizations, and everyone is pointing their fingers at the IMF at how the deal is going to go through between the Pakistani government and the IMF. So the deal to go through between the two is extremely pertinent and important at this day and age. But you also have just explained that there are issues, because if you increase reduce the subsidy, increase the levy, what is going to happen at the end? The public is going to suffer, and this is a very tricky road down the lane. What needs to be done as a middle ground? Do you think that the IMF will agree to some of the demands from Pakistani side to maybe kind of gradually take it one by one?
Okay, that's a very tricky and very important observation you've made. You're absolutely right that there may be a middle ground, but the middle ground may still involve pain. The middle ground may not be an easy and comfortable way forward. It's just that you mitigate the pain. And from that reasoning, then having graduated reduction of the fuel subsidy is a middle path, and it is sensible. Ultimately, being a productive society involves a change in the culture and the values and how we manage society, and not a lot of intellectual effort is assigned to these sorts of tasks, so things go on autopilot. Autopilot is fine in a static environment, but we haven't had a static environment over the last 4 years because of exogenous crises. The COVID pandemic is very severe, the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, the inflationary pressures, and how other countries respond to inflation. So the US has hiked its interest rates, and it's likely to do so more. It's just that it might not do it as aggressively as we thought, but these factors have made us no longer live in a static environment of business as usual and continue that. So the middle path that you suggest is the way, but that still involves some degree of pain, and that does make sense to me.
And that pain, unfortunately, the public will have to take in the long run, because there's no way out of it. It's between the devil and the deep blue sea. You have to take one side and you have to go one way or the other. If you don't, you're going to suffer anyway. So it's better to suffer less than to suffer more. Now, when we come Usman, to the free fall of the rupee, it has been attributed to 3 important things: the country's rising import bill, widening current account deficit, and depleting foreign exchange reserves. When you look at all 3 of these things, and a lot of other questions that have come out from different experts as far as the previous government's performance in on the economic front is concerned,